Welcome back to Specimen the Sociologist. This is your host, Jessamine Rickman. As you may know, I tend to tell people that Jessamine rhymes with specimen, but with a J. I'm a budding sociologist on a mission to figure out the science behind our social lives and how it can be used as a tool to stabilize our social interactions. Now, today's segment is called Principle in a Pod. One day I thought to myself, if peas serve as the substance of pods, how can principles serve as the substance of this podcast? Get it? Podcast. But, anyways, while science is important, it's even more important that we remain sensible to the information that we consume and how we steward it to relate to one another. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's principle, and that being trust. Now, trust is a word that is loosely thrown around, whether it's mentioned in a love song, if it's an argument with a lover, or perhaps the phrase, I'll never trust that person again, and that phrase being buried deep inside your heart. And if you're anything like me, perhaps you're raised with the awareness of who and who not to trust, but perhaps we're not given the tools on how to build trust or identify a trustworthy person. But fear not, your favorite specimen is here to help you. But first, let's begin with breaking down the definition of trust. Now, according to good old fashioned Merriam Webster, trust is the assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. Now, from a sociological perspective, trust is understood as a relational and collective property, one that allows people to become vulnerable to one another by willingly accepting some degree of risk. But I would argue that trust is more than a psychological state. It's a fundamental component of social life that makes society predictable and functional. Like, trust allows us to form confident expectations about how others will act in the future. And this way, it becomes a core element of social capital and, I would argue, again, a necessary condition for cooperation, coordination, and social order. But don't let me get lost in La La Land, and let's pivot back to understanding trust in the context of interpersonal relationships. And to do just that, we're going to turn to American neuroeconomist Dr. Paul J. Zak. Now, in case you're like me and you didn't know what a neuroeconomist was before this podcast, it is a professional who combines neuroscience, psychology, and economics to study how the brain makes decisions. In 2001, American neuroeconomist Dr. Paul J. Zak developed a mathematical relationship between trust and economic performance. While his research was primarily focused on describing the social, legal, and economic environments that cause us differences in trust, there was one simple question that he could not answer. Why do two people trust each other in the first place? Now, to answer this question, Dr. Zak developed a trust game. And in this experiment, participants decided whether to give money to a complete stranger, with the promise that the stranger could return some of it or could keep it all for themselves. Now, when a person chose to trust, the brain released oxytocin, a hormone that encourages social bonding. People with higher oxytocin were more likely to reciprocate trust, not because they were reckless. Rather, it reduced the fear of social betrayal, creating a neural foundation for trust. Now, Dr. Zak's work reveals a fascinating feedback loop. Trusting a stranger releases oxytocin, which makes the other person more likely to act kindly, which reinforces trust. It's our brain's snazzy way of building cooperation even with people we've never met before. So, again, if we look at Zach's research from a sociological perspective, this biochemical mechanism helps explain why groups behave the way they do and why social bonds matter. Stress, for example, can suppress oxytocin, making cooperation harder, whether that be a tense workplace, a rocky relationship with your parents, or even trying to navigate the modern dating scene. On the flip side, empathy and supportive environments boost oxytocin, strengthening connections and making collaborations far more easier. So, in other words, our brains are wired to cooperate, but only when the social conditions feel safe and supportive. Now that we've unpacked the neuroscience of how trust is formed, it's time for my favorite part, and that is the sociology of trust and how its arch nemesis, mistrust, sneaks into our behavior. Because again, mistrust, it can show up in a lot of ways, but I've tried to pinpoint the sneakiest, most subtle signals, like the little things we do or say that quietly reveal that we're not really trusting others. So, the first example is having a pessimistic view towards people. This shifts the default assumption about others from good intentions to self interest or potential harm, whether it's always assuming the worst, skepticism towards generosity, hypervigilance in social interactions, cynical worldview. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. And it's really simple and almost a little too easy to allow a moment of distrust from the past to project itself into your present moments. Next, let's talk about social withdrawal and isolation because this form of mistrust really gets my gears going because it can affect anyone at any age. People may fear being remembered for their drunk shenanigans or worry about being rejected when they reach out or even the general fear of being hurt. Now, these behaviors usually stem from past experiences and it's heartbreaking because they can lead to social anxiety, depression, and a shrinking support network. Now, my brief and unsolicited advice for overcoming this behavior is actually pretty simple, and that is to take the risk of trying again. As we discussed earlier, trust allows people to be vulnerable with one another by willingly accepting some degree of risk. So you may face rejection or judgment, but I can promise you this over time, those small risks can lead to the reward of reconnection and the affirmation of your identity. And if you needed another podcast to help you with this point, I dropped a podcast last season called The Sociology of Self-Esteem. So definitely tune into that if you have yet to listen. But moving on to our next point. Another way that mistrust can subtly present itself in our behavior is through the form of self protection, and not really the good kind. Now, this is the sneakiest form of mistrust because it's often expressed more through our language than through our actions. Distrust often leads to self protection by triggering a defensive mindset that tries to reduce vulnerability and anticipate harm from others, whether it's repressing the question that you've been aching to ask, sharing only the positive parts of a story, or speeding up your response in conversation because you're nervous about being interrupted. The way self protection can subtly show up and then compound over time is honestly endless. Now, there are a few more examples, but I'm going to focus on one more way distrust shows up, and that is through avoiding commitment. Now, this usually comes from fear, whether that's fear of vulnerability, betrayal, or abandonment. And when trust is missing, people pull back from deep connections to protect themselves. And that often looks like a reluctance to commit in a relationship, or I guess in my case, just running away from the issue. And I will be the first to put myself on the chopping block because I really want to bring this point home. And to do that, here's a little story. So, growing up, my parents had an on again, off again relationship for about 18 years. They got married for 5 and then divorced 12 years ago. Now, growing up, I carried a real anxiety around romantic relationships because I kept thinking to myself, whatever the hell that was, I do not want to experience it in my personal life. And so that mindset pushed my dating life all the way back until I turned 21, which I guess I can now legally drink and date. But in all full seriousness, I called it my righteous running away. Like I ran toward homework, student leadership, professional goals and aspirations, anything that felt productive. But in reality, I was just avoiding and repressing those dormant emotions. And it wasn't until I actually started dating that my commitment issues showed up loud and clear. And darling, they were on full display. However, through therapy, theology, tough conversations with loved ones, and taking real risks on romance, I eventually dismantled that false narrative I carried about commitment. And the evidence of that growth isn't that I've been in a 2-year long relationship or married for 25 years. It's that I'm secure in who I am and who I am not. And that self security has made dating, honestly, a lot more fun. Like, I'm very much interested in another person telling me who they are. I can tell them who I am, and we can just kind of get to know each other. Which, side note, not the upcoming episode, but the one after that will be on the sociology of dating, because what we're not going to do is walk into cuffing season without clarity. But, anyways, that final point with a sprinkle of story serves as the perfect transition into the last portion of the podcast, and that is a specimen solution. Now, the greatest advice that my mother ever gave me, which I'm now passing on to you, is this: information is powerless to a person unless you give them tools of application. And that's exactly what we're going to do as we talk about adopting truth as a personal principle. We've just walked through all the subtle, sneaky ways distrust can show up in our lives. But the beautiful news is that there's a one size fits all solution, and that is by becoming a trustworthy person. If you're listening to this podcast, I can almost guarantee you've betrayed someone's trust at some point, and you've probably had your trust betrayed too. That's why we're taking this self aware approach. Because at the end of the day, the only thing you can really control in life is your character and your behavior. So, first things first, when people see that you're honest, reliable, and consistent, they naturally start to lower the guard. For example, this past weekend, I grabbed brunch with one of my girls, and we're still in the early stages of our friendship, even though we've known of each other for quite some time. And before we even yapped over our fish and chips, I stuck up my pinky and I said, whatever you share today stays between us. Because in the past, I've had friendships where information was leaked and it hurt me in a really bad way. But instead of letting that make me sour, I was able to set the standard for how I engage with future relationships. Now, another thing about becoming a trustworthy person is it builds your credibility. When your actions match your words, people don't have to guess your intentions. They can simply trust your sincerity. And the last part about becoming a trustworthy person is that it will transform your mindset. When you act with integrity and transparency, you begin to see others more clearly, not through suspicion, but through understanding. Now, I said I was only going to give you tools on how to become a trustworthy person, but here's one more tool on how to build trust in your relationships. And to do that, we're going to actually lean on Dr. Brene Brown's marble jar theory of trust, which honestly has completely reshaped the many ways that I understand relational safety. So let's talk about something Brene Brown calls the marble jar. Now, this idea is pretty simple. Trust is not built through one grand gesture, rather, it's built slowly, one small action at a time. So think of trust as a jar that fills with marbles. Every time you act with honesty, show up with reliability, or protect someone's confidence, you're dropping a marble in that jar. Now, those small everyday deposits matter. There are things like keeping your word, listening without judgment, showing empathy, being consistent, like the list goes on and on and on. And just as trust is built in small moments, it can be chipped away in small moments. So, marble withdrawals also happen through behaviors like gossiping, dismissing feelings, unreliability, or acting in ways that make people question your integrity. Now, the beauty of the marble jar theory is that it reminds us that trust is built over time and that it's never too late to begin again. Perhaps the jar is symbolic of your relationship with yourself, and that is learning to trust your own voice. Perhaps it's romance, as it was for me, or maybe it's a friendship, and there was a moment when all of the marbles just spilled out. And that's okay, because you can rebuild marble by marble. And I would argue that such a relationship often becomes stronger, carrying greater intentionality, care, and understanding. So, therefore, it's never too late to adopt trust as a principle in your personal life. And with that being said, we're just going to wrap up today's episode on the science of trust. As always, don't forget to subscribe, share, and invest in this podcast if you enjoyed today's conversation. And as a little teaser, next week we will close out our series on anxiety with a book review of The Anxious Generation. And after that, we'll be diving into the sociology of dating. Because as I said earlier, we cannot be going into cuffing season without a little bit of clarity. So until next time, have a powerful day.